My queen, will you rule by my side?
I will.
Forget fairy tales about royal love and noble bloodlines. Ancient Egypt's rulers weren't writing romance, they were writing a slow genetic suicide note. For generations, pharaohs decided the best way to protect their divine heritage wasn't through alliances, wars, or smart marriages. It was through their own family, and not the extended kind. They married their sisters, sometimes even their daughters. What began as a religious statement turned into a biological disaster that no amount of gold or godly power could fix. The logic behind it seemed sound to them, at least on paper. Egyptian royalty believed they were literal descendants of the gods, and in the Egyptian pantheon, divine siblings often married each other. Isis married her brother Osiris, Shu married his sister Tefnut, and so on. To the pharaoh, copying this pattern wasn't taboo, was holy. By marrying a sister or a close relative, a pharaoh wasn't just choosing a spouse. He was reaffirming his divine right to rule, a sacred continuation of the god's example. To marry outside the family, in their eyes, was to dilute the sacred bloodline with mortal weakness. But what was religiously pure on the surface was genetically poisonous underneath. Over time, this obsession with purity meant the royal blood became trapped in a closed loop. The same genes, generation after generation, circulated within a shrinking pool, amplifying defects that would have otherwise disappeared in a larger population. At first, no one noticed. After all, when your ancestors are worshipped as divine, it's hard to imagine they could produce flawed heirs. But biology doesn't care about royal status, and Egypt's divine bloodline was quietly collapsing from within. In the early New Kingdom, sibling marriage among royals was relatively rare, used mainly for symbolic power. A pharaoh might marry his sister for divine legitimacy, but also take other wives, usually from noble or foreign families, to produce heirs. This kept the line stable, at least genetically. But as centuries passed, the practice became more rigid. By the time of the Ptolemist Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great, it was on just tradition. It was law. Every ruler from Ptolemy II to Cleopatra VII followed the same pattern. Marry your sibling, keep the blood pure, and hope your children survive. And that's where the real trouble began. The Ptolemies weren't Egyptian by blood. They were Macedonian Greeks, inheritors of Alexander's empire. But they adopted Egyptian customs to legitimize their rule. They took on the titles of pharaohs, built temples to the gods, and most disastrously embraced the Egyptian tradition of royal incest. Ptolemy II married his full sister, Arsinoe, too, a union that scandalized even Greek contemporaries who saw it as grotesque. But in Egypt, it was framed as divine. From then on, nearly every Ptolemaic ruler married a sibling, niece, or cousin, continuing the self-destructive cycle that would eventually cripple their dynasty. Behind the grand temples and lavish processions, their private lives were genetic minefields. The same DNA repeated itself over and over, like a copied document that becomes more distorted each time. The effects were predictable. Congenital deformities, fragile health, mental instability, and infertility became hallmarks of royal life. Some pharaohs displayed skeletal deformities or cranial elongations, traits that modern researchers link to inbreeding. The famous Tutankhamun, one of Egypt's most iconic rulers, is the tragic poster child for this royal experiment gone wrong. Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings. His father Akhenaten married his own sister, and their union produced a child whose body bore the unmistakable signs of inbreeding. CT scans and DNA tests on Tutankhamun's mummy reveal a long list of medical problems: a clubfoot, a cleft palate, malformed bones, and necrosis in the left foot. He likely walked with the cane archaeologists, found over 100 of them buried with him. His immune system was compromised, and he suffered from malaria. He died before he reached 20. The supposed god king of Egypt, worshipped as the living embodiment of divine perfection, was, in truth, a fragile boy undone by his own bloodline. But Egypt didn't learn from him. The divine narrative was too powerful to abandon. The priests and royal court reinforced the idea that the pharaoh's family was above ordinary mortals. And keeping that divinity intact meant keeping outsiders out. Marrying within the family wasn't just allowed, it was expected. The court scribes and artists even portrayed these marriages as acts of holiness, with inscriptions describing sibling couples as the earthly counterparts of the gods. The problem was that while mythology justified it, biology punished it. Each new generation of pharaohs and royal children became more physically and mentally fragile. Records suggest several Ptolemaic rulers suffered bouts of paranoia, violent temper, or erratic behavior. Some historians believe this instability, combined with the genetic toll, played a major role in the dynasty's political collapse. The last of them, Cleopatra VII, famously known for her beauty and cunning, was the product of generations of close inbreeding. While she managed to maintain her health and intellect, her siblings weren't so lucky. Several of them died young or were eliminated in palace coups, leaving the dynasty hanging by a genetic thread. The irony is that this quest for divine purity achieved the opposite of what it intended. Instead of strengthening the royal line, it made it weaker and more vulnerable. The Egyptian belief system viewed the pharaoh as the ultimate bridge between gods and men, the keeper of balance and order. Yet through incestuous obsession, they disrupted the very order they claimed to protect. Their divine image decayed from within. The same ideology that had made them powerful ensured their slow destruction. Even ordinary Egyptians, who were raised to revere the pharaoh as a god, began to sense something was off. As rulers became more reclusive, their physical abnormalities and strange behaviors became difficult to hide. The image of perfection was cracking. The divine bloodline didn't look divine anymore, looked cursed. And yet, for the royals themselves, there was no escape. Political tradition trapped them. To marry outside the royal family would mean sharing power or legitimacy with someone unworthy. Every generation was caught between divine duty and biological reality, and they chose divine duty every time. Each wedding between siblings was a gamble one that nature kept winning. By the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the royal family was little more than a handful of people, many of them sickly or unstable. Their bloodline was too thin to sustain the empire. The same ideology that had once inspired loyalty and awe now looked grotesque to foreign powers like Rome, who saw Egyptian incest as a symbol of decadence and decay. When Cleopatra's reign ended with her suicide in 30 BCE, so too did centuries of inbreeding that had defined Egypt's monarchy. The last pharaoh's death wasn't just political, it was biological closure. In retrospect, this wasn't just a moral failure. It was scientific suicide centuries before genetics even had a name. Egypt's rulers believed divinity was hereditary, that godhood could be passed from parent to child like property. What they didn't understand was that divine blood doesn't exist when you try to manufacture it through generations of incest. All you create is suffering. The Egyptian pharaohs left behind temples that still stand, monuments that pierce the sky, and a civilization that shaped human history. But buried in those tombs is another story, a warning carved into their very bones. It's the story of power so absolute it turned inward and devoured itself. The quest for purity became the engine of destruction, and the gods they imitated never came to save them from the consequences. So next time you see the golden mask of Tutankhamun or the statues of godlike pharaohs, remember the truth behind that perfection. Those were the faces of a dynasty that believed itself immortal and ended up paying the price of mortality in the cruelest way possible. And if you're enjoying this dive into the dumbest royal decisions that changed history forever, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, because sometimes history's biggest mistakes are written in blood. For Egypt's pharaohs, ruling wasn't just about running an empire, it was about embodying divinity. Every decision, from the way they dressed to the people they married, was meant to preserve that illusion. But as centuries passed, one of those decisions, the belief that divine blood must never mix with mortal blood, became more than just a ritual. It turned into a trap. Pharaohs began prioritizing their family's genes over the health of their kingdom, turning the throne into a genetic, ticking time bomb. What started as a spiritual statement slowly transformed Egypt's royal court into a living laboratory for inbreeding. By placing sacred lineage above common sense, the rulers of Egypt made a choice that would haunt their dynasty for generations. Every pharaoh who married a sister, cousin, or even a daughter believed he was protecting divine order. But in reality, he was building a fragile empire inside his own bloodstream. The Egyptian throne was filled with rulers who were less physically capable, less mentally stable, and more vulnerable to disease than ever before. These weren't the strong, godlike figures carved in stone. They were frail humans trapped in the mythology of their own making. Inbreeding doesn't just weaken individuals, it amplifies the hidden flaws buried in every human genome. Every person carries recessive genes, most of which are harmless, unless paired with another copy from a close relative. When that happens, those silent flaws come to life. For the Egyptian royals, those flaws multiplied with every generation. What had been small, invisible risks in the early dynasties became catastrophic in the later ones. Siblings shared nearly identical DNA, so their children were more likely to inherit double doses of harmful traits, bone deformities, immune disorders, cognitive impairments, and infertility. Tutankhamun's body, for example, is the most famous evidence of this royal collapse. His skeleton tells a story the scribes never wrote down. His father, Akhenaten, had married his own sister. The result was a boy whose body couldn't handle the burden of his own bloodline. Scans of his mummy show a clubfoot curved spine and bone necrosis that left him unable to walk properly. His legs were so fragile that his tomb was filled with canes, over 100 of them, because he needed them daily just to move. Tutankhamun also suffered from a cleft palate and likely chronic pain. Despite being hailed as a living god, he was physically dependent, and his early death around the age of 19 wasn't a tragic accident. It was the predictable result of centuries of inbreeding catching up with the royal family. But the problem went far beyond one unlucky pharaoh. Historians and genetic researchers have uncovered similar evidence in earlier and later dynasties. Mummies from royal tombs show skeletal deformities, misshapen skulls, and signs of congenital diseases. Some had abnormal bone structures around the hips and spine. Others displayed elongated skulls that weren't purely artistic exaggerations, but the results of developmental abnormalities. These weren't isolated cases. They were symptoms of a dynasty that had chosen religion over reason. This obsession with preserving the divine bloodline also had political consequences. As the genetic pool shrank, so did the talent pool. Royal children, often born sick or weak, weren't capable of ruling effectively. Some died in infancy. Others reached adulthood, but were physically unfit for leadership. This left Egypt's vast empire vulnerable to instability, as priests, advisors, and generals filled the power vacuum. Real control slipped out of royal hands, often falling into the grasp of court officials who manipulated young or sickly rulers for their own gain. The pharaoh was supposed to be a symbol of eternal strength, but in practice, he became a puppet of his own system. Even the gods couldn't hide the cracks forever. The royal family's public image relied on propaganda, massive statues, polished reliefs, and hymns declaring their divine perfection. But behind the limestone and gold, the reality was far less majestic. Archaeologists have found numerous depictions of certain pharaohs showing oddly proportioned body-skin limbs, bulging bellies, or elongated heads. For centuries, scholars debated whether this was artistic style or symbolism. Now, DNA and forensic studies suggest it might have been realism. The artists may have been forced to glorify what they saw, giving deformity the mask of divinity. Akhenaten, Tutankhamun's father, is a striking example. His statues show an androgynous figure with wide hips, thin legs, and an elongated skull. Some historians once thought this was a new artistic style meant to reflect religious change. But modern analysis suggests Akhenaten might have suffered from Marfan syndrome, a genetic disorder affecting connective tissue. His strange appearance wasn't a creative statement, it was another consequence of inbreeding. And because he was worshipped as the physical form of the god Aten, his genetic abnormality was literally mistaken for divine uniqueness. Egypt's faith blinded it to biology. Meanwhile, this hereditary weakness bled into governance. As the pharaohs grew physically frail, their grasp on power weakened. Egypt's political structure relied on the image of a strong, godlike ruler who could maintain the cosmic balance between order and chaos. But when your king can barely walk, the illusion of divine control becomes harder to maintain. Military campaigns slowed down. Administrative reforms were left undone. The priesthood, once kept in check by royal authority, began to grow in power again. Egypt's might was built on the stability of its monarchy, and that monarchy was collapsing from genetic decay. It's also worth remembering that Egypt wasn't isolated. Neighboring empires, the Hittites, Assyrians, and Babylonians often cemented alliances through marriage. A foreign princess could bring political peace, trade access, and fresh genetic diversity. But the pharaohs, obsessed with keeping their blood pure, refused such unions. By rejecting political marriages, Egypt lost potential allies and gained nothing but another generation of weak heirs. Their enemies grew stronger, while their own bodies grew weaker. It was a choice that hurt Egypt both biologically and geopolitically. Over time, this fixation on divine purity turned into a kind of hereditary curse. Every pharaoh who inherited the throne inherited the mistakes of his ancestors: mutations, diseases, and frail bodies hidden beneath golden crowns. And every generation made the same decision again, to marry close relatives and repeat the cycle. What was once meant to preserve the throne now ensured its decline. Egypt's rulers became symbols of their own downfall, proof that even gods can't rewrite the laws of nature. The irony is painful. The same system that elevated the pharaoh to godhood also made him vulnerable to the most human flaws imaginable. The priests and courtiers who praised royal purity were unknowingly creating a biological trap that no amount of divine ceremony could escape. By worshipping their own lineage, the rulers of Egypt slowly destroyed it. Their faith was strong, but their genes were failing them one generation at a time. Tutankhamun's frail body became the unintentional testimony to centuries of arrogance. When scientists opened his tomb in 1922, they didn't just uncover treasures and gold, they uncovered the truth of Egypt's greatest mistake. Every bone, every deformity, every medical issue told the same story: that divinity had limits, and those limits were written into the human genome long before anyone understood it. The story of Egypt's inbreeding, ISNT, just about genetics SN, about the danger of confusing faith with fact. The pharaohs believed that blood alone made them divine, but nature proved otherwise. In their obsession with purity, they chose genes over governance, myth over science, and in the end, their empire paid the price. If there was ever a single body that told the truth about Egypt's royal obsession with inbreeding, it was that of Pharaoh Tutankhamun. His tomb was a glittering treasure chest filled with gold, jewels, and symbols of eternal glory. But beneath all that luxury lay a body that revealed the grim cost of divine pride. Tutankhamun was supposed to be the perfect god king, the living son of Aten, and heir to centuries of divine blood. Instead, he was a frail teenager, crippled by the genetic consequences of his ancestors' pure royal marriages. His mummy docenty tell a story of strength. It tells the story of what happens when human biology collides with royal arrogance. When scientists first scanned Tutankhamun's body using advanced CT imaging, they discovered something shocking beneath the layers of linen. His left foot was twisted inward, a condition known as a clubfoot. The bones were malformed, and the arch was collapsed, making it impossible for him to walk normally. This wasn't the kind of injury caused by war or an accident, it was congenital. He was born that way. In simple terms, Tutankhamun's royal bloodline had failed him. His body was the genetic bill that Egypt's rulers had been racking up for generations. The boy who ruled one of the world's most powerful empires couldn't even stand without assistance. Archaeologists found over 130 walking sticks in his tomb, each one carved beautifully, decorated like a royal accessory, but ultimately a symbol of weakness. These weren't ceremonial props, they were medical necessities. Some of the canes even showed signs of wear, suggesting they were used daily. Imagine the irony. A king who was portrayed as a warrior, driving his chariot and slaying enemies, could barely put weight on one of his feet. The famous images of Tutankhamun hunting or leading soldiers were propaganda, painted illusions meant to hide a painful truth. Modern DNA testing has since confirmed that Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings his father. Akhenaten married his own sister, continuing the long-standing royal custom of inbreeding. This genetic isolation didn't just give Tutankhamun a clubfoot, it amplified other weaknesses that plagued his short life. Scans revealed that his bones were brittle and unevenly developed. His skull was slightly elongated, a deformity passed down from his father's line. He had a cleft palate and other skeletal irregularities, suggesting that his body struggled just to grow normally. To make things worse, Tutankhamun also suffered from multiple strains of malaria, which would have been devastating for someone with a weakened immune system. The combination of chronic infections and structural deformities meant that every step he took was painful. Historians once imagined him as a young, vibrant ruler restoring Egypt after the chaos of Akhenaten's reign. But the reality is that he likely spent much of his life in pain, dependent on Kane's servants and ritual attendants to move or perform royal duties. There's also evidence that his physical fragility shaped his reign itself. As Pharaoh, Tutankhamun was expected to be more than a ruler. He was supposed to be a symbol of divine power, leading festivals, standing tall before the gods, and appearing physically flawless during public rituals. But with a clubfoot, misshapen limbs, and frequent illness, he couldn't fulfill that image. This likely limited his appearances in public ceremonies and forced his advisors to take a more active role in ruling. The empire wasn't being led by a god, it was being managed by caretakers. In ancient Egypt, physical perfection wasn't just vanadit, it was a religious expectation. Pharaohs were seen as the earthly embodiment of divine order, the human face of the gods. When a king's body was broken, it wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a spiritual problem. The priests had to hide the truth. In art and inscriptions, Tutankhamun was always depicted as flawless, athletic, and strong, hunting lions or defeating enemies. The artists couldn't show the reality of a limping, sickly boy. To the people, their pharaoh had to look like a god. Behind the palace walls, however, that illusion was crumbling. It's also telling that Tutankhamun's early death around the age of 19 wasn't caused by war, assassination, or political intrigue, but most likely by his own body failing him. One of the strongest theories suggests that he broke his leg, possibly while standing or falling awkwardly due to his clubfoot. The injury became infected, and his compromised immune system couldn't fight it off. Combined with malaria, the infection killed him. In a tragic twist, the man who ruled Egypt's armies died not in battle but because his body couldn't handle a simple injury. Archaeologists studying Tutankhamun's tomb found another revealing detail: numerous medical and walking aids buried among the treasures. The presence of these items tells us something about how his caretakers viewed him. They knew his body was weak, and they wanted to ensure he could walk in the afterlife. In Egyptian belief, the next world was a continuation of life on Earth, and so they buried him with everything he might need. The canes weren't symbols of power, they were reminders of his frailty, the tools of a god who couldn't stand without help. Tutankhamun's condition wasn't just a personal curse. It was a public embarrassment the priests and scribes tried to conceal. Egyptian art was never meant to be realistic, it was idealistic. But even idealism has limits when the truth becomes too visible to ignore. The royal workshops continued producing images of a healthy, athletic king, but these portrayals became a form of denial. Behind the smiling reliefs and the golden mask was a young man who could barely walk, let alone rule an empire. The scientific discoveries made in the 21st century have given us a clearer picture of just how damaged Egypt's royal gene pool had become. Geneticists who examined Tutankhamun's DNA found numerous inherited disorders, including traces suggesting a hormonal imbalance that could explain his elongated limbs and soft facial features. Every one of these conditions is consistent with repeated inbreeding over generations. The pharaohs, in trying to preserve the divine bloodline, had unintentionally poisoned it. And yet, for all his physical weakness, Tutankhamun's fame outlived every healthy pharaoh who came before him. The irony is almost poetic. His tomb, untouched for thousands of years, became the single greatest archaeological discovery in modern history. People around the world remember his name, his mask, and his legend, but few realize that behind that golden face was a broken body. The treasures that made him immortal were really the burial gifts of a sick boy who never had the strength to rule. Tutankhamun's clubfoot has become more than just a medical factoid. A symbol of how far Egypt's royal family fell from its ideals. The same dynasty that built pyramids ruled continents, and proclaimed itself divine couldn't escape the simple reality of human biology. The pharaohs could command armies, shape religions, and build monuments that defied time, but they couldn't outsmart genetics. Every royal wedding between siblings tightened the noose on their own survival. And by Tutankhamun's time, that noose had already closed. So when we think of Tutankhamun, we shouldn't just remember the glittering gold mask or the treasures of his tomb. We should remember the young boy who struggled to walk, the canes he leaned on, and the pain he lived with. His body was Egypt's greatest confession, a silent acknowledgement that the gods, the pharaohs, claimed to descend from Khudin, T saved them from the consequences of their own arrogance. If anything, Tutankhamun's life proves that history's greatest mistakes aren't always made on battlefields or in throne rooms. Sometimes they're written quietly into the blood of kings. So if you've made it this far, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we uncover the moments in history when power, pride, and bad decisions changed everything. Egypt's rulers were supposed to be living God's immortal symbols of strength, divine wisdom, and power made flesh. But by the later dynasties, that godhood had begun to rot from the inside. The repeated cycles of royal inbreeding had left Egypt with pharaohs, who were more fragile than divine, more patient than ruler. The myth of their perfection was collapsing under the weight of biology. A system designed to protect royal purity had created a lineage of physically broken and mentally unstable monarchs who could barely perform the rituals meant to keep the gods on their side. The throne, once a symbol of unshakable authority, became a seat of frailty. When we look through the records, it is striking how many of these divine rulers were barely functional in their own reigns. Their bodies told the story of a dynasty that had turned on itself. Medical scans, skeletal remains, and artistic depictions reveal a pattern misshapen skulls, spinal deformities, elongated limbs, cleft palates, and conditions suggesting neurological impairment. These weren't isolated cases. They were the physical fingerprints of centuries of sibling marriage. The result wasn't a dynasty of gods. It was a slow-motion collapse of vitality and leadership. For Egypt, whose entire system depended on the pharaoh as a living link between the gods and humanity, this weakness was catastrophic. The king wasn't just a political leader, he was the center of religion, the embodiment of Mat, the divine order that kept the world in balance. When the pharaoh was sick, unstable, or incapable, that balance broke. Religious rituals faltered, and with them came social uncertainty. The people feared that the gods were angry, and priests scrambled to maintain the illusion that the ruler's physical frailty was somehow sacred instead of shameful. Behind palace doors, court physicians became some of the most important men in Egypt, not because they could heal, but because they could hide. But the effects went far beyond the palace walls. A physically weak pharaoh meant a weak empire. Egypt's foreign policy depended heavily on personal leadership. The image of the warrior king leading armies into battle, riding in chariots, and crushing enemies beneath divine banners was essential to maintaining political power. When the ruler could barely walk or worse, couldn't even stand the military machine faltered. Generals hesitated to act without royal blessing, provinces became restless, and rival powers sensed blood in the water. The empire's borders shrank. Not because of foreign brilliance, but because the men who ruled Egypt were too fragile to defend it. Court politics grew poisonous. When the pharaoh was too young, too sick, or too feeble to rule, the vacuum of power was filled by ambitious priests, royal wives, and advisors. Inbreeding didn't just damage bodies, it fractured the chain of command. The royal family became a battlefield of manipulation and intrigue, where courtiers used the pharaoh's frailty to advance their own interests. Each generation saw more backroom power struggles, and each struggle made the state less stable. The empire's administration became paralyzed by factions that treated the throne as a tool rather than a divine institution. We can see this most clearly during and after the reigns of Tutankhamun and his immediate successors. After generations of royal intermarriage, the line had produced a string of short-lived, sickly kings. Each one required heavy support from priests and generals, meaning real power drifted away from the pharaoh and into the hands of bureaucrats. The divine monarchy became a puppet show, the ruler's golden mask concealing not authority, but dependency. Egypt's spiritual unity, once its greatest strength, fractured as regional governors and temple leaders began to act independently, knowing the center of power was weak. The artwork from this period shows subtle changes too. While older carvings depicted kings in perfect symmetry and ideal proportions. Later, reliefs became oddly stylized, exaggerating the heads and limbs of rulers, perhaps an echo of their real deformities hidden beneath layers of divine imagery. Akhenaten, Tutankhamun's father, was famously shown with an elongated skull, wide hips, and spindly arms. For centuries, scholars debated whether this was an artistic style or medical truth. DNA and forensic studies have since confirmed that these features weren't mere artistic choices, they reflected the genetic consequences of the incestuous royal line. Inbreeding didn't just affect the physical health of rulers, it may have also impaired their cognitive stability. Geneticists have suggested that disorders linked to repeated familial unions can influence brain development, leading to unpredictable behavior, anxiety, and irrational decision-making. When you place such a person at the head of the world's most powerful kingdom, you get rulers who act out of emotion rather than strategy. Akhenaten's obsession with his monotheistic cult, Tutankhamun's uncertain leadership, and the disorganized reigns that followed all point toward dynastic decline caused not by war, but by biology. As the pharaohs grew weaker, the priests grew stronger. Temples, particularly those dedicated to Amun, took over many state functions. They became economic centers, tax collectors, and political power brokers. While the royal family obsessed over divine bloodlines, the priesthood quietly amassed wealth and influence. By the time of the later dynasties, some temple complexes controlled more land and gold than the palace itself. Egypt had effectively divided itself into two powers, one ceremonial and sickly, the other bureaucratic and ambitious. The priests of Amun were no longer servants of the throne. They were competitors. The idea of a frail god-king also shattered Egypt's propaganda. The pharaoh was supposed to be a being of both mortal and divine nature, standing tall as the perfect human form of the gods. When that image cracked when the people saw their rulers limping, coughing, or dying, it undermined the entire system of divine monarchy. In the eyes of the population, divine favor seemed to be slipping away. After all, how could a ruler, chosen by the gods, be born deformed, crippled, or diseased? For a civilization built on the perfection of the divine body, a broken ruler wasn't just tragic, it was blasphemous. This decline wasn't sudden, it was slow, almost invisible, stretching across generations as each new pharaoh inherited not just the throne, but centuries of genetic decay. The temples filled the gaps, the generals grew impatient, and the empire's enemies, Hittites, Nubians, and later the Assyrians, watched Egypt's proud legacy crumble from within. In the end, the power of the throne was reduced to ceremony. And even that lost its meaning when the god-king was too weak to stand during rituals. The psychological toll must have been immense too. Imagine growing up as a prince in the royal palace, worshipped as divine but trapped in a body that betrayed you daily. Every limp, every ache, every whisper of deformity reminded you that you were not the god you were told to be. Some of these rulers likely lived with constant pain, yet they were expected to project divine serenity. The royal court became a theater of denial, where every priest, advisor, and artisan had to pretend that the visibly broken body of the pharaoh was merely the mystery of the gods. And so Egypt's golden bloodline turned to dust. What had once been the empire's most sacred tradition, marrying within the royal family, became the very poison that destroyed it. The later dynasties were filled with fragile monarchs, whose weakness invited foreign powers and internal revolts alike. Each generation tried to preserve divine purity, but all they preserved was disease. The gods they imitated might have been immortal, but their mortal descendants were paying the price. The story of these crippled rulers isn't just about medical history, it's about how power, obsession, and arrogance can eat away at the very foundations of an empire. Egypt didn't fall because of a single invasion or rebellion. It fell because its rulers believed they were above the laws of nature, and nature, in the end, always takes its revenge. The collapse of Egypt's royal bloodline was not sudden. It was not the result of invasion, rebellion, or natural disaster. It was a slow, self-inflicted unraveling an empire, strangled by its own traditions. The pharaohs, once the most powerful figures in the ancient world, became victims of their own divine myth. In their desperate attempt to preserve sacred purity, they built a genetic prison that weakened them generation after generation. What had once symbolized divine legitimacy turned into a curse that no priest or physician could undo. By the later dynasties, the damage was impossible to hide. Royal portraits, once crafted to show physical perfection, began to betray subtle deformities. In temples, priests recited prayers to mask the frailty of kings who could barely stand during ceremonies. The illusion of godhood was cracking, and everyone inside the palace knew it. Egypt's royal family had become a line of ghosts wearing gold masks. The divine blood that once set them apart had become poison running through their veins. The pharaoh's divine right was meant to separate him from ordinary men. By marrying sisters and daughters, rulers believed they were mirroring the gods themselves, Isis and Osiris, Nut and Geb divine siblings, whose unions created the world. This religious symbolism was powerful, and for centuries it worked. The people saw their rulers as extensions of the gods. The royal family saw themselves as living deities, but nature is cruel to those who ignore its laws. Each generation of intermarriage shrank the gene pool, amplifying defects, weakening immune systems, and passing on deformities that no amount of gold or ceremony could conceal. Tutankhamun was only one of many victims. His clubfoot, frail bones, and dependence on canes were not isolated misfortunes. They were the visible signs of a dynasty devoured by its own tradition. His father, Akhenaten, was likely afflicted by similar genetic issues. Earlier rulers displayed elongated skulls, cleft palates, and skeletal deformities that modern forensic scans can trace to recessive genes intensified through centuries of incest. The divine family was collapsing from within, and yet they kept going, trapped in the belief that impurity was worse than extinction. Politically, this devotion to purity was suicide. A strong empire depends on adaptable leadership, but Egypt's rulers were locked into an ever-narrowing pool of potential heirs. The same few families intermarried for centuries, leaving the throne vulnerable to sudden extinction when disease, infertility, or early death struck. Succession crises became common, and with them came chaos. Priests, generals, and distant relatives fought over the crown while pretending to defend divine order. Each conflict drained the empire's resources and shattered the illusion of eternal stability that Egypt had projected for millennia. Beyond the palace, the empire itself was changing. New powers rose on the horizon: the Hittites in Anatolia, the Assyrians in Mesopotamia, and the Nubians to the south. Egypt, once a symbol of invincibility, found itself struggling to maintain its borders. Armies that had once marched across deserts now stumbled under weak command. The pharaohs, too sickly to lead, relied on advisors and mercenaries. These outsiders had no loyalty to the throne's divine myth. They served for gold, not faith. The result was a kingdom ruled by courtiers and priests, while the crown became a ceremonial relic. Even the religious justification for incest began to lose power. The people, once convinced that divine blood made the pharaoh a god among men, began to see weakness instead of holiness. The divine connection had become hollow. Temples whispered of hidden gods, priests shifted their allegiance to spiritual figures like Amen, and ordinary Egyptians placed more trust in local deities than in the palace. The divine aura of kingship, the foundation of Egypt's unity, was evaporating. At its core, this was the tragedy of obsession. The rulers of Egypt believed that breaking tradition would anger the gods and doom the kingdom. Yet it was their stubborn devotion to that same tradition that doomed them instead. In a way, it was the perfect irony: the most powerful civilization of the ancient world destroyed not by enemies, but by its own myth of perfection. The more the pharaohs tried to preserve their godhood, the more human they became. And the more human they became, the weaker their empire grew. The signs of decay were everywhere. Royal tombs were less grand, royal reigns shorter. Economic strain deepened as temple wealth outgrew royal income. Priests collected taxes once reserved for the crown. The once mighty bureaucracy, which had managed everything from irrigation to construction, began to crumble under corruption and inefficiency. Each failing pharaoh left behind unfinished monuments and unpaid workers. The great projects that had once defined Egypt, the pyramids, the temples, the colossal statues, became rare. Instead of building the future, the empire was busy preserving the past. Foreign influence crept in. Greeks, Nubians, and later Persians began to occupy Egypt, not through conquest at first, but through trade and diplomacy. Each power saw an opportunity in Egypt's fragility. The divine pharaoh could no longer intimidate anyone. Alliances shifted, loyalties faded, and soon Egypt, once the master of diplomacy, became a pawn in larger games. When invaders finally came, there was little resistance. The empire that had stood for thousands of years fell not with a bang, but with a quiet surrender. Yet even as the kingdom decayed, the royal ideology didn't die. The last generations of pharaohs still clung to their divine myth, still buried themselves in elaborate tombs, and still tried to marry within the family. Tradition, even in ruin, held them captive. It was as if the idea of being gods mattered more than survival itself. That's what makes Egypt's downfall so haunting. It wasn't ignorance, and it wasn't arrogance alone. It was faith taken to its most destructive extreme. The same genetic studies that revealed Tutankhamun's ailments also exposed the depth of Egypt's biological decline. Mitochondrial DNA, traced within the royal mummies, shows an extraordinary level of genetic similarity, proof that generations of intermarriage had created a near-homogeneous bloodline. These rulers weren't just family, they were mirrors of each other. Born with the same weaknesses, the same vulnerabilities, their devotion to purity had erased the very diversity that gives life resilience. What they saw as divine was, in truth, decay disguised as destiny. If you think about it, there's a strange beauty in that downfall. Egypt's pharaohs were victims of their own myth-making architects of both glory and ruin. They built a civilization so powerful that even their mistakes became timeless lessons. Their pyramids still rise from the sand, symbols of human ambition reaching toward eternity. But beneath them lie the mummies of rulers undone by their refusal to change. Every sarcophagus is a reminder that perfection, when pursued without reason, becomes destruction. Their story forces us to question how far people will go to preserve an idea. The pharaohs' incestuous unions were not acts of lust or arrogance alone, they were acts of devotion. They believed they were protecting Egypt, maintaining the order of the cosmos. But devotion without wisdom is dangerous. It blinds you to consequence. In the end, their greatest strength, their unwavering faith in their own divinity, was the very thing that ensured their end. That's why Egypt's fall feels so human. It wasn't the work of conquerors or a cataclysm, but of belief. The kind of belief that makes people cling to old ways even when they know the cost. The royal bloodline didn't die in a single battle, or with one failed ruler it dissolved, drop by drop, over generations, until nothing was left but myths and bones. And that's where we leave them, not as gods, not as monsters, but as people, flawed, fearful, and fatally devoted to their own legend. A dynasty that rose on divine faith and fell on human frailty. If you found this story as haunting as it is fascinating, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historianware. The past's strangest mistakes remind us that even gods can destroy themselves.